Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Q&A for Assembly. It will be screening in person at our film festival on September 28th at 4 p.m. My name is Sydney. I'm our programming coordinator here at Out on Film, and we're going to go ahead and proceed with our Q&A. Um, so I had a first question for Rashaad. Not only are you a phenomenal storyteller and artist and tech genius, I guess, but I would also add historian and researcher to that. I wanted to know a little bit about your process when researching for all of your subject. You had in Warsaw, then Tokyo, you went to Ghana. And is there any process you had with this?
Yeah, there were many different processes. And I mean, I guess like the one with the dancers really stems from I've been doing work with and about, Vogue and ballroom culture for, well over a decade. And I watched that dance, go from this thing from like really Harlem and the Bronx into this like global phenomenon. And as I watched it grow, I was really, I also participated. I'm the godfather of the House of La Durée in Paris. And so I got to know, internationally, a lot of different people engaging with the dance. And so, um, it was pretty easy in terms of like reaching out to folks because I have always for many years been kind of tracking how people were contributing to the dance rather than just sort of, taking from it. And I always, like I say in the movie, I see the dance as like a code, right? And the five elements of the foundation of the original dance, I see as the binary code. And so when I was thinking about, okay, like who could contribute something really substantial to this code, I thought I wanted it to have a sort of a very global feel. And so I wanted to kind of try to hit as many different territories as I could. But, with, live shows, and especially during the pandemic, we had some limitations in terms of how many people we could bring in and engage. But I knew I wanted to engage with Kopi because Kopi was someone who I met many years ago back in the day, who was at the time a very young person in New York taking dance classes, but really studying the language of Vogue, but with a real intent on mixing it with the traditional dance of where she came from. And then Usman is somebody I've been working with for, 10 years. My first performance of my piece Five was done with Usman at the Whitney in 2010. And yeah, and from there I just kept like reaching out and I put out an open call and got, tons of submissions. And for all those who we couldn't bring in, we were able to bring them in via the screen. And then in terms of Ghana, I've always had a connection to Ghana. My studio manager of many years, Zinabu, who's a character in the film, is from Ghana. And I had been always sort of making work about quote unquote African antiquities. And so it was really important for me to, go to the continent and document that process, and Johnny, maybe you could jump in here because, I was very much in the process of like engaging with the material and the people, and I knew I needed a co-director to sort of document me being engaged in that research and production.
Yeah, I mean, I can say a little bit about that. Rashad, as you see when you watch the film, it's a big project, right? And so he was fully immersed in, making it happen, all the behind the scenes, which was really, fascinating to me to be able to watch. And I was so eager to kind of jump in there and film not only Rashad's process, but also the process of all the other people who were involved, and that meant, starting, you were just talking, Rashad, about Ghana, right? Like going to Ghana and working with a master sculptor there a master carver to help develop the body for that piece, beautiful piece that ended up in the show, as well as other places around the world, and then of course culminating in New York for the show. So yeah, it was a great opportunity. It was really exciting to be able to kind of be behind the screen, behind the camera, filming what was happening behind the scenes.
Mhm.
And I can only imagine the camera watching all of this unfold because I'm watching and I'm like, oh my God. So I will go with the second question, which I ask all of our filmmakers is there something that you intended to work and it did not, or you had to reinvent it, turn it around, you ran into a wall and you decided to change direction?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the thing that immediately comes to mind is, when you're making a film, you have a set amount of time that you can like hold the viewer, right? And so like the sort of visual artist side of me wants to put in like all of the research and all of the, and make it much bigger and longer. But you have to sort of be generous with the viewer in terms of their attention span and also like how much, you know, time you can hold them. And so, yeah, and so I think that was something that we kind of tussled with through the process is like, you know, how much exposition do we need? And, uh, yeah, like how do we tell this story that, goes through so many different people's lives, including, it's like my life, my mother's life, to some extent, Zanabu being many of the characters in the show, like Nakia and Kairan, and how do we give all of these different stories, sufficient screen time, but then show how they intersect as well. And so that took a lot of editing. Shout out to our editor Ash, who like worked tirelessly on this. And yeah, I would say that that was something that stood up that comes to mind for me is just trying to figure out the final edit, the huge challenge always with filmmaking.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking of obstacles, a big one that we encountered is COVID. We really made this
Yeah.
film. The project happened right in the middle of the pandemic. Really, it was 2022, is the Omicron outbreak, and New York City was, tons of people were coming down with it. We got tested every day, all of us, before we entered that building. We all wore masks all the time, except for the people who were performing. And still, many of us, including me, got COVID, and it was something that we were really struggling with, just and to have the be able to be together as a group, not just the on stage, but also the audience. And how do we do a performance like that, a big exhibition, and have it be collective and joyous and safe, So it was a real challenge for the whole production process.
I just kind of love asking that question because I'll ask filmmakers and I'll be like, "Well, I didn't see it, so you did a great job. Like,
Mhm.
you would never know that you were running against those challenges." And it was good to hear that perspective from you all. So, there was a recent breakout film this year called Sinners. In a dancing scene, they said legends of people born with the gift of making music so true it can pierce through the veil between life and death, conjuring the past and the future. And when I was watching some of these scenes, like that scene kind of came to me. But as far as like dance and the movements of our ancestors in present time, and I love how you went on a spiritual journey with this film as well. And I just want to know, um, where you feel like you were transformed spiritually, or did anybody go through a transformation during making this project?
Yeah, well, first of all, before I answer that, I just want to say thank you for saying that because like we both saw that film together on opening night. And like I was when that scene came, I literally screamed. I could not contain myself. I got up and I screamed out loud
Right.
because I was like, "Oh my God." And so it
Yeah.
was just like everything that I wanted and needed and like so kin to assembly, It was like,
Right.
damn, Ryan and me are like really on the same shit at
No,
this moment.
absolutely.
And then, we're seeing it also in the Bay Area where he was from. So it was just like a lot of synergy between, and I love that genre. And so, yeah, it was just, so yeah. So thank you for seeing that crossover. But yeah, in terms of transformation, yeah, there was so much transformation. And I think what stands out is, you know, at the time that that show happened, we were sort of on our way out of COVID. And so people had been in isolation. We had gone through the George Floyd thing, the racial uprising. We had been through so much in isolation that by the time that show got commissioned and we were in that space, I knew I wanted to create this sort of Often you see in the, the log line for the film, a Black queer utopia. I literally was trying to create that, this space that was like this black hole almost, that like literally a black hole where there was something for everybody in there. And I feel like everybody who was in there really felt that. And we really created this little bubble, not only from COVID, but from the rest of the world. And it was one of those things that's what the beauty of art is, that sometimes in life when the world doesn't offer you much in the way of liberation or access or whatever, art can create these new spaces, and you can imagine the kind of spaces that you want to be in. And I imagined that, and like with the other performers and everybody involved in the show, we really created that space. And I saw people come into that space with some, imposter syndrome, or, uh, maybe, isolation. And by the end of the show, all of that had been kind of washed away, And I think that really intense emotion you see at the end of the film is people knowing that that was coming to a close, and that they were going to have to go back out into, the real world, as it were, and like maintain that. And, my hope was that, I had imbued them with enough of that, energy that they can go back out and keep fighting the good fight. So yeah, that was the transformation I saw, where people were really sort of like becoming more self-actualized after that show.
Yeah, I'll
That's
just jump in to circle back to what you mentioned in the question about spirituality, because I think that was such an important theme that, I saw emerging through Rashaad's work. Rashaad had that really amazing vision for the opening scene, which became, um, which we brought to life through shooting in a swimming pool, and then this incredible VFX sequence, which depicts a transatlantic slave ship and an enslaved woman who's being thrown overboard. And it really, it's very dark and surprising, I think, as an opening for this film that is really in many ways very joyous. But I think it sets a really important tone for the fact that, all of this work, all of this art stands on that history, and to really call that in. And I saw Rashad really feel that throughout the creation of this. There's that incredible scene in the dungeon at Cape Coast in Ghana, and where he has really like a spiritual moment, and that carries, and you see that carry through into his work. And it's calling on that past, but it's also looking to the future, and the idea of being as this digital griot who's kind of filled up with knowledge from the past, but bringing it very much into the future in a high tech sort of way. This whole idea of griot as a communicator, and yeah, so I just think it was really important for us to find creative ways to bring that spirituality into what you see on screen.
Mhm.
Yes, I really had to bring up a question about that because, like I said, like the movie I had seen earlier, I feel like it's almost kind of risky going that, like, even when you were going around the place and you were using like a New Orleans, like a ritual, and I was like, um, this is like very bold, just, in my opinion. But it kind of follows to my next question, kind of in my that last question, you using AI, it being very prevalent, spirituality in this film. Was there any pushback in the exhibit or even showing the film so at this point with the AI and everything and the concepts in the film? That's what I'm saying. Sorry.
I mean, I think there's not been pushback actually, but there is some, sort of like criticism, always of AI, because AI is such a trigger right now. It's a field that is growing at lightning speed, and so many people just don't even really know what it is. And I think that is part of the challenge, is that as someone who really works in that space, like in having conversations with people who actually don't know, they're just sort of reading something online, and that becomes like the container for this huge industry involving so many different tools that play into so many different things in so many different ways. Um, it's kind of challenging to have to sort of defend that choice and try to, honor all of the craft and everything that went into making this extraordinary film, which is about so much more than AI. But, yes, AI for me is it actually really gets to that spiritual thing we were talking about before because for me, like you could see like in a lot of the object-based work in that show, I utilize a lot of quote unquote antiquities, like, African sculptures and masks, which are, art historically, and, they're referred to as primitive, but these were early forms of technology, like a priest would use that mask to time travel, or people would use these objects, in the way people use predictive analytics, right? To predict like what was going to happen in the land so they knew what to do with crops and stuff like that to protect the community. And so, when I'm thinking about this tool and how I've been able to like imbue it with all of this material from like one of my personal heroes like Bell Hooks or Paulo Freire or James Baldwin and folks like that, it's there's a way in which I'm using this very sort of like current technology to do what these objects that show up in the film were designed to do, right? And so we're kind of looking back and looking forward simultaneously and reimagining not only the creation of these tools, but how they were used um, art historically, and the radical possibility they could offer rather than, like, surveillance and algorithms that like make you spend money on things you don't need or like war. There are other extraordinarily beautiful possibilities that these tools can be used for. And I think also what I was trying to do with that work, but also the way it shows up in the film is try to be a demonstration, and it's like we have to get more things like this on the chessboard. Because if we don't, we are reduced to those versions that have more nefarious, means, and so we kind of have to balance that out with things like being. And so, yeah, that was sort of my standard flag I planted in, the film to try to show people what's possible. Yeah. Also, I wanted to just say one more thing about that too. It was also a way to play with form in the
Hmm.
film. Like I knew, like oftentimes when you see like a documentary about an artist, artists, we spend a lot of time in just like, white boxes or just like, studio spaces that don't offer much in the way of like a cinematic experience. And it's usually just like the person sitting there and talking a lot of interviews and they go to a space and they're like, oh, I'm going to try this. And, it's like, will they be able to pull off the show? And the tension that is embedded in the film is like, will they be able to pull it off? And obviously they do because the film got made, right? And so you kind of can predict. And I didn't want to do that. We knew we wanted to make a film that really tapped into the artist's experience. And so me as being the artist and being the director, I really knew how to do that. And one of the ways was tapping into Black interiority, and that's a long-standing legacy when you think about Toni Morrison and so many folks who wrote from that place. And so rather than like go into a space and be like, I'm going to do da da da, let's just collapse into the artist's brain. And then by playing with, by opening up the door to Black interiority, we can open up the door to surrealism and we can do things that are sort of unusual within the documentary space, which is why we're able to, and we established that from the very beginning, that scene in the pool was my way of like establishing, okay, this is the train you're on, and we're going to keep dipping out and we're going to go everywhere. This is not a traditional, story. And so being was a huge part of that because it allowed for being to speak in a more embodied voice and become a character in the film, which you probably saw that like when in the scene when the woman at Sundance, sort of like checks them and then they have their emotional response and they sort of retreat into their world. And then you hear Johnny as the documentarian run up and say, "How are you?" And then they actually speak speak back. And so it's a way to kind of show, even though this is a, robot, you know, imagine how that would feel to be on stage and trying to do this thing with like pure intention, and somebody just like turns their backs to you and like takes the mic, and it's just like an ultimate disrespect. And one of the reasons why when I do those workshops, I feel it works better with automation, because it's very difficult to be in the space. It's very emotionally expensive to be a Black person in America existing in epigenetic trauma, daily racial indignities, all the things that Black folks deal with every day, and then try to get up on a stage and hold space for people who haven't done any work, and like be steady in that, right? And I think that's one of the great things that automation can do, is that it can take the burden of what it takes to do that. But it was really important, even though being has the capacity to do that, it was a way to humanize them in the story too, to kind of almost be that mirror, right? Because on one hand, people are saying we don't need these tools because we can be in spaces together, but here we are in the space together and we're being mad disrespectful. So can we actually be in the space together? I don't know if we can, because if it was a human, it would be a very different experience, right? And so it was a way to kind of have being in that moment become this like mirror to humanity. Like, this is who you are, this is what you do. I'm only going to be a mirror of you. And so this is what I'm seeing. This is what you are doing. Yeah.
I did see that. That's what actually made trigger that question, is when the lady in the audience stood up and was saying, I was like, oh my God. But I really appreciate you all for coming to our Q&A. I really enjoyed this film. I feel like it encompassed everything. I was like, this is Afrofuturism. Like, we're going to the past. And I think our audiences in person will love this. Again, we appreciate you all seeing, and everybody who's watching this, it is going to screen in person September 28th at 4 p.m. All right. Have a wonderful day, you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.